I'm Afshin Ratansi, and as demonstrators march 10 months to the day of a catastrophe when the poorest of one of the world's richest communities on earth burnt to death in London, we speak to hip-hop artist Lowkey, who saw the Grenfell Tower disaster firsthand. But before that, here is an excerpt from his song, Ghosts of Grenfell, featuring Mike Khalil.
The night our eyes changed. Rooms where love was made and unmade in a flash of the night. Rooms where memories drowned in fumes of poison. Rooms where futures were planned and the imagination of children built castles in the sky. Rooms where both the extraordinary and the mundane were lived, become forever tortured graves of ash. Oh, you political class, so servile to corporate power.
Well, joining me now is Lowkey. Lowkey, thanks for coming on Going Underground. I've got to say, a lot of the world, even mainstream media, talking about the threat of World War III. We'll get on to anti-imperialism in the second half of this show, but why is today's march so important when it comes to addressing the political class and corporate power?
Well, I think the massively significant thing about the march is that it has spread to Bristol, it's spread to Liverpool. You have people in Manchester also doing it. You have people in Ireland now apparently doing it. I received a message today from someone in Southampton where they will be doing it. The point is that there is a confluence of three issues which caused the Grenfell fire. And these three issues actually relate to wide sectors of society. It's not simply something that can be atomized and placed specifically at the doorstep of one single thing. It's kind of the end result, the tangible end result of a kind of incremental and attritional form of violence that was pursued following the 80s when Thatcher took what were 300 plus pages of building regulations and replaced them with around 20 plus pages. Now, it has been a kind of bipartisan orthodoxy of neoliberal necropolitics. And what we're seeing is, in the silent march, a form of peaceful resistance and rebellion against that orthodoxy. So when we look at that period in the Thatcher era, when you had this gradual weakening of building regulations, what it led to is it led to the period where John Prescott basically approached
as deputy.
Exactly, in 2003, approached something called Approved Document B, which was in the building regulations at that time. And that opened the space for something called Desktop Studies Number 1, but also the ability for construction companies to interpret the rules on cladding to be of Class O rather than of limited combustibility, which is the other classification which the government, following the Grenfell fire, claimed. You had Philip Hammond come out 4 days afterwards on Andrew Marr and say, this is banned in this country. You had on the 22nd of June, the government come out and say all cladding should be limited combustibility rather than Class 0. Now, let's take into account that in Scotland, following the Garnock fire in 2010, they said that there should not be used combustible materials in building construction. And the thing with the Thatcher era is it changed the regulations from prescriptive to performance-based. And so the important thing is not the components of the structure, but what it does. And so the basis of testing on Class 0, which is what the construction companies claim for the cladding, is it focuses on the surface. So the initial cladding you have Arconic, and it's a Renault brand of Arconic, and what it is you have a 0.6 millimeter layer of aluminium, and then behind it the core is 0.6 millimeters of polyethylene. And then behind that is another aluminium, and this was on Grenfell. After that, you had the insulation, which was Celotex RS5000, which they're now not selling, of course, which undoubtedly is flammable and failed all tests post-Grenfell for limited combustibility. Now, what you had in the Prescott era was this kind of changing and this ambiguity, and it's within that bureaucratic violence that neoliberalism really flourishes. You had the potential for two things. BRE, Building Research Establishment, that was founded in 1948, but then was privatized, of course, in 1997. What that ended up doing was them allowing companies to come to them, pay them £15,000 and test themselves, and then describe the tests. And the point is that Celotex did a test on their RS5000 insulation post-Grenfell, and it pre-Grenfell, and it failed. Now, the point is they came out earlier this year and said they actually misdescribed what the test had been, because the point is the onus is on the companies under this existing system to describe the test and say what happened. So they've come out saying we misdescribed it. So the point is that this movement and weakening of building regulations led to a point where not only on Grenfell but on 300 social housing towers in the country you have this. Only 7 of them they're starting to take it off. Untold amount of hotels, untold amount of private blocks, untold amount of schools and hospitals. Right now in this country, people are sleeping in death traps. And the point is that you're seeing an attempt to obfuscate blame. So you're seeing the government, on one hand, saying it's because of the way that these companies have interpreted the building regulations. Then on the other hand, you have a situation where local government have kind of been converted into conduits of corporate power. So in a situation, and this is why this march will achieve such a wide encompassing appeal, because you have leaseholders in Croydon, you have leaseholders in Capital Quay in Greenwich, who are in a situation where they're being told they have to pay £40,000 service charge to get this poisonous cladding removed from their block. Now they're really in a terrible position because they can't sell their properties and they can't afford to get this stuff removed.
All those places in London.
Yes.
But I'm sure the government will immediately respond by saying that's why they've instituted an inquiry. And Theresa May should be congratulated for that. You actually saw the fire when it was going on.
Yeah, I lost people I love in there.
Did you immediately think of the emblematic nature of it for neoliberalism or engineering?
Certainly not. It was apocalyptic, what we were seeing, and we were just trying to cope with the reality that was in front of us. The important thing to note as well, that this, the third issue that this is a confluence of, is, a situation of austerity. You have 1,000 jobs cut from the fire service, you have £100 million cut from the fire service, you have 10 fire stations closed, 29 fire engines gone, 50% defunded in the Royal Borough of Kensington-Chelsea, despite the fact they had a surplus of £300 million, despite the fact that fire deaths were up by 20%. So that led to a situation where not only were the fire brigade coming in and keeping to the stay put policy, which was absolutely disastrous, moreover, they were coming in with walkie-talkies that didn't work. Now, we know after the Lachenal fire, in which 6 people died and one of them was a 3-year-old child, right, it was recommended that you fit sprinklers in all new places, but also you retroactively fit sprinklers in other places.
There is a Chief of Staff, Gavin Barwell, allegedly sitting on that Lachenal fire report.
Yes, and it would have cost them around £130,000 for them to do it at Grenfell. But this is the same borough where you have a £370 million refurbishment of Buckingham Palace.
This programme has come under attack, actually, for politicising, as have other members, certainly of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, of politicising this catastrophe.
Yeah.
You said you knew people who died and perished in the Grenfell disaster. How is it both personal and political, then?
Well, this is the way that, they say infrastructure is invisible until it malfunctions. So this is the way that violence, which starts on paper, manifests into people's lives. And, what we are in the position of doing is having to close that gap and say, OK, this is where something happened, and when a society reaches this level of complexity of the society that we have, these kind of things, are almost an inevitability to some extent. But the point is that you have to be able to build those mechanisms which can protect people. And so what we're seeing local government and national government converted into, tools, really, of corporate power. And it's what John Weeks calls it, the re-regulation, not deregulation, re-regulation, in the interests of capital against the interests of the human.
To which those corporate executives would say, yes, but it's an accident. The fact that people died perhaps of cyanide poisoning is not a chemical attack on the poor, ethnic cleansing. This was just an accident. OK,
well, the fact is this. We know that after the Kyoto agreements, Celotex and Kingspan were actually boasting, to the extent that Celotex put on their website in 2011, Celotex now enters government and is shaping building regulations to maximise benefits to our industry. The fact is they knew that the Kyoto agreements would mean the British government were in a situation where they wanted to insulate more buildings, and that was something lobbied for. That wasn't something accidental that just happened. It was something lobbied for specifically. They also knew and had liable cases against other companies who were coming out as early as 2007 saying RS 5000 burns.
This is Celotex, the insulation.
The insulation.
Well, I should say
and the other point, by the way, about desktop studies, which they are now lobbying, Kingspan, for example, to keep. When it's under review now, they're lobbying to keep desktop studies. You know what desktop studies mean? Is they mean that when you have a cladding that has 0.6 millimeters of polyethylene in it, and then you have Celotex insulation, rather than actually testing them together, which is done in Scotland now, by the way, because after the Gone Up fire, this would not happen in Scotland, after 2005, sorry. you're in a situation where you don't test these things together. You do something called a desktop study. And a desktop study means that someone who's not an expert can take the information from one test that's been done, right, on the cladding, and then another test that's been done on the insulation, put them together and estimate the danger. Is this really rational?
Well,
is this really logical?
We did ask why a senior executive from the company that makes that insulation, Mark Allen, is a advisor to the government on building regulation. I should say, they said, I'd like to confirm that in Mark Allen's role as technical director of St. Gobain, UK and Ireland, he played no part in the supply of Celotex products in relation to the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. So there is a separation here between those advising the government on building regulation and the manufacturers, isn't there?
Of course there's not. Of course there's not. If I'm advising you on how to regulate the industry which I'm a representative of, I'm going to advise you based on my interest.
The government responds by saying that's why they get them. They're experts because they work in the field.
No, they're not. They're biased. And as soon as we start to attribute agency in these situations, we get told it's about a conspiracy theory. Well, no, it's not. And surely Sajid Javid should issue a statement about that. Why is it that the technical director of Saint-Gobain, which Celotex is a subsidiary of, right, can be advising the government on building regulations?
As I say,
and this
they say there was a Chinese wall of some kind.
Well, this permeates throughout many industries, and this is indicative and symptomatic of the violence of neoliberalism. Okay. And it's not just socially violent; it's actually socially murderous. These policies, because when you're in a situation where the company knows they're selling stuff which actually is highly flammable, right, as evidenced by the fact that they're bringing liable cases against other companies that are coming out online and saying the stuff is flammable, and yet they still sell it. And yet we're now in a situation where literally people are sleeping in death traps all across the country. This is a systemic problem. And that is why the silent march, while it's called a silent march, we will not go quietly into the night. Be absolutely clear about this. We lost one person. When Kelso Cochrane died in 1959, right, that led to the Notting Hill Carnival after that. When Claudia Jones and the Free School, and they were planting seeds for trees they wouldn't sit in the shade of, right? That was on the strength of the Caribbean community in Ladbroke Grove. What do you think we are going to be able to build after many generations, after an intergenerational struggle, off of the basis of at minimum 72 people dying?
Well,
and it will be nationwide.
Lowkey, well, the march is on at 6 p.m. in Kensington and Chelsea this evening. We're going to have more from Lowkey on imperialist foreign policy after the break, but here he is and the people affected by the tragedy addressing the borough of Kensington, Chelsea and London in his song Ghosts of Grenfell.
To whom it may concern, at the Queen's Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, where is Yassin al-Wahhabi? Where is his brother Mehdi? Where is his sister Nur Huda? Where is their mother? And where is their father?
Where is Noura Jamal? Where is her husband Ashim?
Where is their children? Yahya, Firdaus, and Yaqub.
Where is Nadia Loueda?
Where is Steve Power?
Where is Dennis Murphy? Where is Marco Gottardi?
Where is Gloria Trevisan?
Where is Amal and her daughter Amaya?
Where is Mohammed Nader?
Where is Aliwa Jafari? Where is Khadija Saeed?
Where is Mariam El-Gawari?
Where is her mother Suar?
Tell us, where is Rania Ibrahim and her two daughters?
Where is Jessica Ubano Ramirez?
Where is Deborah Lambral?
Where is Mohammed Al-Hajj Ali?
Where is Nadia? Where is her husband Basim?
Where are her daughters, Mina, Fatima, and Zainab, and their grandmother?
Where is Zainab Deen?
Her son Jeremiah.
Where is Ligaya Moore? Where is Sheila?
Where is Mohammed Nur Tuku?
Where is Tony Dissy?
Where is Maria Baz?
Where is Fataya El-Sanusi?
Where is your son Abu Faraz?
Daughter Ezra. Where is Lucas James?
Where is Farah Hamdan?
Where is Amar Belkani?
Where is their daughter Lina?
Where is Hamid Khani?
Where is Hesham Ram?
Where is Raymond Bernard?
Where is Isaac Powell? Where is Marjorie Vitale?
Where is your son
Where is
Ali?
Kumrumiya?
Where is his wife Razi? Where are their children Abdul Hanif?
Abdul Hamid and Husna.
Where are Sakina and Fatima?
Where is Barki Habtoum and her son Barouk? Tell us.
Where is Stefan Anthony Reynolds?
Where is Abdel Salam?
Where is Khadija Khalif?
Where is Karen Bernard?
Where are these people? Where are these people?
Where is Gary Mundus?
Where is Ramina Begum Ali?
Where is her 6-year-old daughter, Mariam?
Her 5-year-old daughter Hafiz?
And her 3-year-old son, Mohammed? God bless you all.
Where are these people? Where are these people?
There'll be ashes on your graves. Like a phoenix we will rise. The blood is on your hands. There'll be ashes on your graves. Like a phoenix we will rise.
Welcome back. We're still here with Lowkey for this special episode of Going Underground. And as we delve into Western imperialism in our second half, let's begin with a verse from Lowkey's and Kaya's song, Lords of War.
Protesting, shattered hopes and dreams adorn the floor. The face behind the screen has seen it all before. And the worst thing about it is there's more in store. Just another sacrifice to the lords of war. The royal family sell guns. The royal family sell bombs. That kill the world's poorest people. The government sell guns. The government sell bombs. That kill the world's poorest people. Sacrosanct march of industry. The sacrosanct march of industry does such strange things to people. The spectatorship is suffering. The spectatorship is suffering does all such strange things to people.
An excerpt of Lords of War by Lowkey and Kaya there. Lowkey, we seem to be on the precipice of another war in Syria. I know you've long predicted one. Forget the weapons sales, the weapons look set to be used. How do you characterize British and American policy on Syria?
Well, I think we're living through the convulsions of the US empire, the dying convulsions. And we're in a situation where a kind of McCarthyite attitude is being stirred up amongst the public. But if we actually take the facts into account, who is it that has NATO troops within miles of their border doing exercises? Who is it that's in a situation in the last 100 years, so within the memory of people's grandparents, that invaded who? You know, in 1917, it was the British, the French, the Americans, the Japanese that invaded Russia. You know, Trump recently wanted to add 54 billion to the US yearly military expenditure, which was 700 billion, so that's 754 billion now. That 54 billion that was added is 80% of Russia's military expenditure yearly. So you're talking about a massively, massively uneven situation. So while that empire is in decline, it's lashing out in kind of acts of micro-militarism.
Uneven, but of course the big accusation on mainstream media here in Britain is the asymmetric warfare conducted by Vladimir Putin and Russia against people in Britain, in Salisbury. What did you make of that narrative?
Well, I mean,
ahead of the latest events?
Well, of course, we're in a situation where we have a foreign secretary who's come out to have not only have been untruthful and basing statements on not enough evidence to make that statement, but moreover, he's somebody that is attacking Jeremy Corbyn in a manufactured idea of anti-Semitism. Let's be clear, the only racist person in that equation is Boris Johnson. He was talking about black people as pickaninnies. He was talking about watermelon smiles, and that's not been forgotten. You know, Jeremy Corbyn has a flawless record of anti-racist campaigning.
Well, Johnson says Corbyn is speaking from the Kremlin playbook.
Yeah, I mean, this is classic building on McCarthyite propaganda, you know, that has been latent in some ways in this society and in the United States. But of course, it's being unfortunately exploited and potentially to disastrous ends.
We know what Trump has been saying about Iran for quite a long time. We had his national security advisor on here talking about Iran before he had to resign. How is it you forecast that Syria would be a target, let alone whatever is happening as regards Hezbollah in West Beirut being a target in Lebanon?
Well, I think it's really inevitable that the US military, who has military bases in, you know, a majority of countries in the world now, has a presence of some kind. You know, even within this country, there's those that estimate there's 104 US military installations in Britain. Of course, the militaries that are not in that kind of area of influence are in some ways going to be targeted. So it is an inevitability that that would happen, you know.
And what do you make of the standard media narrative here? Is something must be done, though? We've seen those images on that YouTube video of a chemical attack. And I have to say, Theresa May now urging some caution of all people on the OPCW investigations into what happened in Ghouta. Something must be done. What do you...
Well, you know, of course, those images are harrowing, you know, but the fact is that there's extreme double standards within the sort of liberal interventionist agenda when we look at, for instance, the fact that the British government sell components to sniper rifles to the Israelis, and recently we have seen snipers in the IDF shooting people who are merely trying to practice what is their right under UN Resolution 194, which is returning.
The Israeli government has said it will conduct an inquiry into those sniper videos.
But, you know, moreover, you have the British government basically working with Rafael, an Israeli arms company to make the drones that the naval protectors that also buttress the siege of Gaza. So there is extreme double standards. Yeah, there's extreme double standards in this, you know.
You've been, I know you've taken some time away from your music, but even your music from a few years back, often referencing histories that aren't taught in any British national curriculum, or I know you're doing education and you're doing a master's now. Why do you think they're not in school history books here in Britain?
Well, I think
the facts in your music.
Well, we have a conception of history from the curriculum that starts with 1066, William the Conqueror. It sometimes goes to the Magna Carta. It fast forwards to the Second World War. And what that allows us to do is envisage ourselves as, rather than being occupiers of 12,700,000 miles of the globe as we were in 1914, rather than being, you know, a mongrel nation as we were, you know, from the Normans basically establishing the monarchy, and, you know, the Huguenots coming, and, you know, Angles and Saxons and different, you know, we're an amalgamation of different people. What it does is it builds a vertical solidarity between people here and between their ruling class, who, despite the fact that they're economically traitorous, you know, the ruling class since the Thatcher era, since the loan from the IMF in 76, have been economically traitorous. They've sold off key state assets to the state companies of foreign countries. But they are able to, by creating this narrative and by imbuing the young people with this idea of a kind of permanence to Englishness, they're able to build this idea that, you know, we weren't conquerors, you know, that Britain never ever shall be slaves. But of course we know that when Britons were mentioned, you know, by the Romans, period when the Romans occupied Britain and established London as a military base, you know, the first mention of Britons was as slaves in a market. So all of these kind of mythologies act to kind of create this idea of Britishness and of Englishness, often in order to buttress acts of state violence, unfortunately.
Well, given the events in Palestine in the past 24 hours, of course, the leader of Western Europe's largest socialist movement, Jeremy Corbyn, has made some of that history and all his political career, but he's been talking about, say, weapons sales to Israel, there need to be an inquiry. He's considered to be someone now, certainly in mainstream political narratives, as buttressing up anti-Semitism in Britain.
Well, of course, that is just a complete manufactured mantra by the corporate media in order to try and get people away from, you know, Jeremy Corbyn, but moreover to try and bully him out of his pro-justice stance, shall we say. But we cannot ever forget the fact that, you know, Britain is inherently and intimately linked to Israeli violence, from the point of, obviously, the Balfour Declaration, which led to the establishing throughout the mandate period of the apartheid system. But moreover, you had in 1936 a heroic, one of the longest strikes that have ever been in recorded human history of the Palestinian people. In 1936, you had Windgate, who went there and trained what were at that time Zionist gangs and militarized them even more. You know, of course, Moshe Dayan, who was the implementer of Plan Dalet in 1948, ethnic cleanser of Palestine, said, "We are all Wingate's children." So Britain has been intimately linked to Israeli violence since then. You had Harold Wilson in 1967 sell hundreds of British tanks to the Israelis and allow them to go ahead and occupy the West Bank and Gaza and so forth. So, you know, it's not just that relationship, it's the current relationship where you have 100 companies that have offices in Britain that actually sell arms to Israel. You have the Watchkeeper, and it's two ways, the bonds over arms between Britain and Israel. You know, you have the Watchkeeper project, which is Elbit Systems, and BAE Systems, which is, you know, £1 billion project to, you know, the biggest drone project in Europe. You have on top of that, you know, just months prior to the 2014 Gaza campaign that cost over 2,000 Palestinian people's lives. You had the British selling around £7 million worth of military components to the Israelis. And then within weeks of that said campaign, the British selling £4 million worth of weapons to the Israelis. And a situation where under the International Arms Trade Treaty, any government that does this has to assess before they do it whether these may be used for human rights violations. Well, we have seen repeatedly Israel has bombed UN compounds, has bombed schools. You know, they are at the moment, in terms of in Gaza, you're in a situation where not only do you have an electrified fence, you also have a watchtower that has a remote-controlled machine gun on the top that's controlled by an all-female battalion in the Negev desert. But on top of that, you now have snipers shooting at people that, like I say, UN Resolution 194, those people have the right to return home.
As I said, Israel said there's going to be an inquiry, and of course they said their bombing of UN shelters was all part of a legitimate campaign because of human Shields, this information you're giving me and in your music, obviously, as I said, not available in schools. The BBC is sending in people into British schools to combat fake news. This was in the context, of course, of the banning of this television station. How should we trust our media?
Well, I think it's having an awareness that, there's a popular perception of there being an ability to be objective. But let's be absolutely clear. Alistair Milne, who was the Director General of the BBC in the 1980s, was in a situation where Duncan Campbell, who at that time was making a programme for the BBC, had found out that the government, and specifically Michael Heseltine, the Defence Minister at that time, were passing around internal memos about the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And also they were, again, coming back with this mythology of CND somehow being tools of Soviet propaganda, as it were. Now, the point is, at that point, when it was clear that massive things were about to be exposed about the government, the special branch raided the BBC studio. Alistair Milne was forced to step down as the Director General, and the programme never aired. And this was really an interesting period of time because you had these interests clashing in a major way. We also, of course, saw it over the situation with David Kelly as well. These platforms which claim to have objectivity are really peddling an absolute fallacy.
Lowkey, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, we'll have music from Lowkey in a second, but we'll be back on Monday with the editor-in-chief of Rai Al-Youm, Abdel Bari Atwan, as the international community squares up two NATO nations threatening an all-out war catalyzed by a YouTube video purportedly from the Damascus suburbs of Syria. Till then, keep in touch via social media. We'll see you on Monday, 190 years to the day of the death of the Spanish anti-imperialist painter Goya. And here is Lowkey with a verse from his song, The Death of Neoliberalism.
History favors the trailblazers. The taste for change is contagious. It's no strange these faceless takers are afraid of raising wages when the same mangy papers say that we should hate our neighbors. Then when the rage cascades, these sadist claim that their blame is what is clear. Some don't even pay taxes on their profits here. Vote against the interests of Murdoch and Rothermere. Not conspiracy theory, conspiracy actuality. Until now, politics merely a practical.